A broke alcoholic is walking down the street, depressed that he can't afford a beer, when he spots a magic lamp lying in the gutter, and he picks it up and he gives it a rub, and out comes this genie. "I will grant you 3 wishes," says the genie, who is apparently Transylvanian for this joke. "What is your first wish?" And the drunk goes, "Give me a pint glass of beer that never runs out." And the genie says, "I will grant this wish." And poof, the alcoholic has a pint of beer that will never run out. And the genie says, "What would you like your other 2 wishes to be?" And the alcoholic looks at his drink and he says, "Give me 2 more of these." You don't like my joke? No. Dog does not approve. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Bat Country. Some alcoholics drink steadily through the day, every day, while some people periodically binge drink themselves to oblivion, episodically. I went through periods of both, but by the end, it was kind of both of them combined. I was drinking binge drinking amounts every day. It's been a very long time since I had a relapse binge, but that doesn't make me feel more secure. Quite the opposite. I'm actually quite a nervous, sober person. I feel confident in my sobriety, but never really secure. It's like climbing a rope ladder. It's perfectly safe, but it never feels stable. I want to talk about binge drinking in general today, but to do that, I need to talk about my own personal experience with it. I need to talk about what my binges looked like a little bit. This might be hard going, I think, this video. It's been a while since I've done a video like this, and it always takes a lot out of me to do it. So if by the end of it you found it cathartic, or you found any of it useful, put anything into perspective for you, please do like and subscribe. And now that I'm sober, I need that little dopamine rush anywhere I can get it. My drinking went through several phases, several identifiable eras. Between my early teens and mid-20s, I was just like a big drinker. I would get drunk and do wild things and be active and out and about and socializing and stuff while I was drinking really heavily. And then between my mid-20s to my very early 30s, I became a kind of what's commonly known as a functioning alcoholic. That is to say, I was drinking to drunkenness every day, but still holding down a job and not really seeing, at least at the start, not really seeing the terrible consequences of chronic alcoholism. I was hiding it and lying about it, but generally getting away with it. And then somewhere around 30, I became a binge drinker. And that period was really the worst. The most destructive, certainly. And the hardest to talk about to this day, even though I spend most of my time here talking about it. And that period started as a result of the functional alcoholism, a phrase that I dislike a lot. But I had identified that drinking had become a problem for me in my day-to-day life. And I tried to quit on my own, tried to stop it and couldn't. So I'd have periods of sobriety, but then a week or 2 would go by and my dumb addict brain would like flip a switch and say, okay, you're cured, you're safe now, you've got it under control, you've proved to yourself and to the world that you have this thing under control, you may as well go back to enjoying alcohol. And I'd have 1 drink and then I would immediately make up for all of the lost time in sobriety, all of the lost drinking time. If I was sober for 2 weeks, I would do 2 weeks of drinking in 2 days. And repeat, and repeat. And over time, in fact really quickly, those periods of sobriety grew shorter and shorter, and the binge periods grew longer and longer. And I did that every day until it became chronic alcoholism at binge drinking levels. It was like chronic binge drinking alcoholism. Every day was a binge. And that's why I ended up with unusually severe symptoms of withdrawal severe withdrawal syndrome, delirium tremens, alcoholic hallucinosis, and alcoholic psychosis. 4 different diagnoses there. All of them overlap with each other, but I went through it all. Until the only periods where I would be sober were because I was in detox or in a psych ward. That was my sober time. And in fact, I remember coming out of a psych ward once after delirium tremens and walking across the road from the hospital into an Asian store where I bought 2 bottles of Baijiu, which is 70% by volume. That's 140 proof for my American viewers. And I was drunk by the time I got home from the hospital. So that attempt to stop being a functioning alcoholic was technically successful, but only in as much as I became a suicidal, obliterative binge drinker. In an effort to quit on my own, I accidentally ended up accelerating the progress of my alcoholism until I was so deep into that cycle that the idea of sobriety was just no longer in my consciousness. It wasn't so much that I was choosing not to get sober. It was more like sober, I had no awareness of it. It's hard to explain. It just wasn't part of my vocabulary anymore. I saw this illusionist once, this illusion show on stage, and the illusionist got this random guy up from the audience, and he hypnotized him so that he could no longer see the color yellow. And then with him in the stage, all these guys in yellow jumpsuits, like head to toe in yellow, came out and started moving the set of the stage around, causing this guy to react with confusion and fear. And then they brought out this kind of yellow forklift, and there was a car on the stage, and the forklift lifted the car and was moving it around the stage, causing this guy to freak out because he couldn't see the color yellow, so he thought the car was floating. That's what my relationship with sobriety is like in a binge. I'm like the guy who's been hypnotized not to see the color yellow. Everybody else can see it. Everybody else is aware that it's there, except me. I'm aware, before you jump in the comments, I'm aware that stage hypnosis like that is all fake and stuff, but I was a kid when I saw it, and it did stick with me. Part of the process of getting sober and maintaining sobriety is understanding where that binge behavior came from if you are a binge drinker like me. Too many people are unwilling to wrestle with this kind of work where you have to consider all of your negative emotions and your negative past behavior, because they worry that by reliving that kind of negative behavior will cause some kind of cycle into negative emotions and therefore spur them to drink. Or they think it's just unhealthy to live in the past, as they say. But I think about it a lot, and to paraphrase the philosopher George Santayana via Winston Churchill, those who don't learn from the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And that includes your own history. There's a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy in recovery. A lot of rehab work is all cognitive behavioral therapy. That's why a lot of people in sobriety find Stoicism such a useful system, including me, for sobriety, because CBT is largely modernized Stoicism with a few kind of innovations. And that's what reflecting on all of your negative behavior in the past, that's what examining what it was that was making you behave like that. That's cognitive behavioral therapy. So don't be afraid to examine your own drinking history for clues that might help you avoid a relapse in future. And that's kind of what we're doing today. So if we're trying to understand binge drinking, what exactly is a binge? Well, naturally, our governments have stepped in and provided us with some very helpful guidelines about binge drinking that are naturally absolutely fucking useless. So ignore those. They're all about like whether you drink 5 units in one sitting and stuff like that. It doesn't translate to the real world very well. We're kind of on our own here, and each person's drinking patterns are unique to that person. And I think it's easier to define it by behavior than by statistics. So let's look at some characteristics of binge drinking in order to identify exactly what it is. So I'm going to characterize binge drinking in the following way, with the following characteristics from my own behavior. If you feel like I'm missing something, or if you want to offer an alternative or better definition, please do so in the comments, and I'll pin the best one or something. So, according to me, according to my own behavior, binge drinking is drinking to get drunk. That is to say, drinking to get drunk at the cost of everything else. So whether it's socializing, or it's sex, or it's wanting to feel confident, or wanting to feel creative, or wanting to relax, all of that goes out the window if you're drinking specifically to get drunk. When everything becomes secondary to being drunk, that's binge drinking behavior. Number 2, drinking heavily and very quickly, especially to numb negative emotions or to escape from some event. And then drinking regardless of the consequences, even if you know the consequences will be negative. Next, if it is difficult to stop the binge, the drinking, or if you accidentally extend it longer than you had intended. If you're having trouble, like, for me, the obvious one is if you wake up and you drink immediately, then you're in a binge. That's binge drinking behavior. If all of those things happen in one sitting or one drinking session, let's say, then that's binge drinking behavior. And generally for binge drinking, there also needs to be periods of sobriety and abstinence. I'll add another one that may well just be me and just be purely my experience. It sometimes feels like it's something that's happening to you rather than something you are doing. That last one's a little hard to explain, but I know what I mean. Maybe you do too. For me, that list of my own binge drinking behavior, it appeared and began way before I became a serious binge drinker. I can spot bits of it earlier in my drinking. Even when I was a relatively normal drinker, whatever that is, if I arrived at a pub or a party and all my friends were already there, I would drink faster to catch up. And therefore I would usually be the drunkest person in the room pretty quickly. Or I would deliberately not eat before I started drinking so that I could get drunker faster. And the night would never be over until there was simply no alcohol left to drink anymore. All of these things were early warnings. It just took me decades to recognize them. Even back then, when I was quite young, quite early in my heavy drinking, teens and 20s, I didn't know it, I was already drinking for the sake of escapism. I still don't know to this day exactly what it was I was trying to escape, but the pattern was there early. And now that I've mentioned it, why do people binge drink? Why do we get trapped in that cycle in the first place? Well, the reason why people binge drink, if it's something that you're doing right now, only you can figure out why you're doing it. People's drinking patterns are completely unique to them. It depends on so many factors. Your entire constitution is what goes into making you a binge drinker or not. It can be one reason or many reasons or many combinations of reasons. And while there are certainly commonalities across the board, I can really only talk about my own reasons and see if any of them feel familiar to you. Okay, so first there is a cultural component. I described myself as a big drinker a moment ago, but we all were. At 16, we were all necking cider in muddy fields and disappearing into the woods or on benches in local parks, like with a bottle of vodka up our sleeve, that kind of thing. Dumping it when we see the police coming. It was normal. And it was so cheap and so available too. But we were all doing it. We all were. But then, if we were all doing it, why was I the only one who emerged later as an alcoholic? Well, that brings me to the second thing. The first is culture. The second is genetics. But first, let me just mention that if that question has occurred to you, that you are the only person from your younger friend group who turned out to be an alcoholic, and you wonder why that is, I can assure you, I bet my imaginary hat on it, that you're not the only one. Since I've got sober, I found out recently that several of people from my friend group growing up also developed drinking problems. And not all of them made it. You know, some of them still have problems. Some of them got sober and some of them didn't even make it this far. So I guarantee you're not the only one. The truth is that you're not the only one. We just don't talk about it, even amongst friend groups. As you start to grow up and spread out and start to lose contact a little bit, have your own lives, we culturally don't talk about these things very much. And we have an obligation, or like a coded in obligation, to protect each other's dignity, but also not to pull back the curtain on this issue in case what we see is our own reflection. And therefore, we just don't really broach it with each other very often. But anyway, the genetics is the second biggest component, and some of us are predisposed to an alcohol problem. If we went our entire lives without ever consuming any alcohol, we might never know. But the moment we do, the moment we introduce one molecule of alcohol, then it's like feeding a mogwai after midnight. And it's weird, it's not just a condition that can be transmitted genetically, it's also the behavior. So if, for example, your grandfather was a binge drinker, there's a good chance that you might be too. But if he was a chronic day drinking alcoholic every day, then that's probably going to be your pattern too. Or it's a higher chance of being your pattern. So like chronic or episodic or whatever kind of alcoholic, that can also be transmitted genetically. Another reason why we get trapped in the binge drinking cycle, for me anyway, was social awkwardness, introversion, self-consciousness, just like social discomfort, for lack of a better phrase. I was kind of a popular-ish kid. I had a big friend group. Wasn't completely isolated, wasn't bullied or anything like that. But what being popular-ish, what passing meant for me, was not that I was naturally charismatic or good-looking or anything like that, or athletic. It was just that I was good at hiding the fact that I was a kind of private and awkward kid. I hid my social awkwardness behind alcohol from the very start. But in the long term, that just didn't help at all. I remember watching an advert for Bacardi or something, where this cool, sexy musician jumped off a stage into the crowd and was crowd surfing. And he looked very cool and interesting and stuff like that. And I did that once in the Rond-Point in France when I was 21. I jumped off a stage and did crowd surfing. And I remember thinking, even while I was drunk, like, I'm not enjoying this kind of forced fun. And I remember thinking, I wonder if anybody here in this room full of 300 people really truly does enjoy it. But for a long time, I tried to be that guy. I tried to be that fun person. I tried to be cool and interesting and confident and sexy and all of that stuff. And I used alcohol to help me try to be that guy, or at least distract people from realizing that I actually was not that guy. And I was, in fact, just a shattering mess of introverted emotion inside. That I was, in fact, very sensitive and not this kind of cool and interesting person. And that really tripped me up in my 30s. I'd spent a lot of time trying to convince everybody that I was that cool, interesting guy, and crowd surfing and drinking exotic liquors and all of this stuff. But as I got older, I started to worry that I was aging out of that persona that I had tried so hard to become. By the time I felt like I'd become that, or was making progress towards becoming it, I was suddenly getting older, getting too old to be that person. I was aging out of being cool, and that was a threat to my identity. And I doubled down on the drinking and the recklessness, and to try to kind of keep up with the younger, cool people who were now doing what I was doing 5 or 6 years ago, and who were now kind of cool and interesting and sexy. All the things that I had wanted to be, they now were. And because I was getting older, the only way I knew how to keep up was to really slam it. God, that's embarrassing to admit. But at some point, that ride has to stop. And you have to figure out who you really are and learn to enjoy that more honest version of yourself. And maybe it's not entirely social awkwardness. Something a little bit more like... What I'm describing there is a bit more like cognitive dissonance. The difference between the person that you think you're supposed to be and the person that you actually are underneath. And if those two identities don't match up, it creates a cognitive dissonance. And alcohol can help you kind of cover the gaps a little bit. And that applies to quite a broad range of people. I think that's partially why a lot of people in the armed forces drink the way that they do. There's a lot of alcoholism in the armed forces. And it's because there's a lot of pressure on those people to be really tough and hard and kind of emotionless. But underneath, they're often quite sensitive people. And that sensitivity underneath, or that empathy, or whatever, the humanity underneath that persona that they feel like they have to create, that also creates a sense of cognitive dissonance. There's a lot of alcoholism in the ranks because of that. It's also true there's a very strong correlation between addiction, alcohol in particular, and gender and body dysmorphia. There's a sense of dissonance where your identity doesn't match your image of your identity. It's like identity dysmorphia, I suppose. And I think a lot of us have that to some extent. Anyway, another reason for me, kind of a big one, this was a complex network of underlying and undiagnosed mental health problems. It's hard to know whether the major depressive disorder and the generalized anxiety disorder came before the alcohol, or the alcohol came first, or whether they all came together and are in fact just symptoms of an overarching condition. Whatever the case, in the end, all of those problems added up to the same thing. The mental health and the alcohol, they were all part of the same kind of complex, indistinguishable from each other. And they formed a kind of mutually supporting cycle of addiction. Binge drinking. I drink because I'm depressed. I'm depressed, so I drink. And then if you combine all of that stuff, all of those binge drinking characteristics, with a huge desire for self-destruction and obliteration, then you have a pretty good recipe for a suicidal, nihilistic binge drinking pattern like mine. And there comes a point where you know it's bad for you when you take the first drink. You know it's bad, and you do it anyway, because fuck the consequences. Does any of that sound like you, I wonder? So why is binge drinking so hard to control? Well, it's kind of because binge drinking, by definition, is a lack of control to start with. You're like a Pringles can. Once you pop, if one of the reasons that you keep falling into binges is because you're occasionally using massive volumes of alcohol to escape from stress or social awkwardness or depression or loneliness or whatever, then alcohol does seem to take the edge off those things for a while. It seems to turn your brain off, makes you less receptive to the negative emotions, makes you less able to feel. And in that way, it's very effective as short-term relief. It's a very good aspirin. Unfortunately, though, that it's so effective that it only reinforces that behavior. Because once you're in the bottle to hide from something, and it works for a while, then you're going to return to that strategy every time you have any negative emotion, over and over again. And pretty quickly, in my experience, that cycle completely replaces your natural reward systems. And alcohol becomes the only way to feel any of the effects of dopamine. And those effects, they diminish over time. And it diminishes the more you drink, which means that you have to drink more for diminishing rewards. And that's a race to the bottom. What I just described, by the way, that kind of reducing dopamine levels, that is brain damage of a sort. Like, alcohol does all manner of damage to your brain. Even infrequent binge drinking causes lasting damage. It takes a long time to recover. And the more frequently you do it, and the more you drink during those binges, the more damage is left behind. And unfortunately, this is just compounding effects of alcohol, is that one of the ways that that damage can manifest is in decreasing self-control, which means that it gets harder and harder to prevent yourself from having that first drink. And when you get to that stage, the brakes are kind of off at that point. They're on fire. And if you're at that stage, it's just getting harder and harder to pull yourself out. And that's why it's hard to break out of that binge cycle. It's because the binge is self-sustaining. God, this all felt suspiciously like advice, didn't it? And I tried to avoid giving actual advice. Sorry about that. It's just I don't want people to go through what I did. I remember a time when it was after I'd spent several months cycling from Shanghai to London. It was after I'd returned, after I punched the cop in Kazakhstan and got deported to Azerbaijan and then deported back to the UK. I was a mess by the time I got home from that journey, and I went and stayed with my parents. They looked after me for 2 weeks. I was a real mess. It was months of living in the desert on a diet of vodka and bread and ramen and Mars bars, and nothing else. And I stayed with my parents for 2 weeks, and back then, I knew nothing about alcohol, except how to put it in the hole in my face. Beyond that, I knew nothing about alcoholism or sobriety or withdrawal or delirium tremens. I was so naive. But I knew that I had a problem. I knew before I set off for the journey that I had a problem. And I got back to my parents and I had 2 weeks of sobriety. My first probably ever purely real dedicated 2 weeks of sobriety. Certainly for years, it was the only long period of sobriety that I'd had. And after 2 weeks, I decided that I was cured. And I went to Zagreb in Croatia to restart my job. So when I arrived with my 2 weeks of sobriety, I was kind of committed to staying sober. I knew then that I was an alcoholic, but I thought back then that I would just stop being an alcoholic. That was my treatment plan. That was my sober strategy, was to just not be that thing anymore. I lasted about a week, 8 days. I lasted. So I went into an Airbnb for 7 days, and then one of my colleagues offered me a room for free until I found something more permanent, because I was supposed to be there long term. So I was looking for an actual house, and he offered me a spare room, which was just a mattress in an empty room that he had available in his apartment. And I'm a simple man. That's all I needed back then. And I think that he was expecting a really cool and interesting guy who we could cycle to work and back and drink good coffee in smoky underground Zagreb bars and cafes and stuff. And he got that for 1 day. He drove me to work the first day that I stayed with him. We had lunch with the team, and he drove me home, and that was the last time that we did that. The second day, of staying with him, I smuggled home a big bottle of beer and drank it alone on that mattress on the floor in his apartment. And then the third day, I had already switched to vodka. And then by the fourth day, I was drinking at work again. It happened so fast. And he had brought me into his house, offered me a room for free, gave me every convenience I needed. He even gave me a laptop to use because I hadn't picked one up yet since I'd been back. But after that fourth day, we didn't even see each other in his house, in his apartment, because I was always alone in my room, drinking as heavily as I could, as quickly as I could. It just creeps up on you so fast, especially when you're in early sobriety like I was, and especially when you're completely naive about the real effects of alcohol, which the vast majority of people are. Most people know how to drink it. Very few people know what the consequences can be. And I still think about, that was 5.5 years ago, that anecdote. And I still think about it all the time. It just takes one moment like that, one decision to drink like that. That tiny moment will cost you years of beating yourself up and self-recrimination. That anecdote from 5.5 years ago, that period that I was staying in that guy's apartment, is still, to this day, sometimes stops me in the street at random and makes me cringe. And that story is way worse than I just made it sound. It gets really, really ugly and dark. And I have a million of those. I'm cringing all the time when a new invasive memory just pops into my brain of some terrible public binge that I had. And it only takes one moment to go back to that. But that's also how we beat this thing. Not just one day at a time, but one moment at a time. Thank you for watching. And if you've made it this far, do subscribe and do all of that YouTube malarkey. And as always, good luck out there.